The needle was still in the wall. That was the detail Arbiter Prime Sorath Vel couldn't stop returning to. Not the bodies. There were always bodies after a siege. Not the structural collapse of the Eastern Quadrant, nor the thermal scarring that had turned the station's observation deck into a black glass mirror. Those things made sense. Those things had causes she could document, measure, file into a report that other arbiters would read and nod at without feeling anything shift beneath their understanding of the universe. The needle was different. It was human-made. She was certain of that much, because nothing else in known space used drawn steel as a material anymore. Thin as a stylus, the length of her smallest finger, driven so precisely into the polymer wall panel that it required 3 of her staff members and a prying tool to extract. No obvious weapon, no obvious purpose. And yet it had been placed there with unmistakable deliberateness, at exactly the height a human would reach without stretching, at exactly the angle of someone who needed both hands free immediately afterward. Someone had done something with that needle. Something that changed the outcome of what happened on this station. She just didn't know what yet. And somewhere in the wreckage of Relay Station Cathara 7, among the cooling systems and the shattered comms arrays and the 11 alien species who had been left here to die by a galactic coalition that decided the math didn't justify a rescue, somewhere in all of that, the answer was waiting for her. She was not prepared for what it would do to her when she finally found it. 6 weeks earlier, the Ketharin Relay had been the most strategically useless installation in the outer settlement corridor. That was the official assessment. Sorath Vel had read it herself. 3 separate coalition infrastructure reviews, each one more dismissive than the last, each one arriving at the same conclusion. Cathara 7 occupied a gravitational dead zone between 2 transit lanes. Its communications range overlapped with 4 superior relay networks, and its maintenance costs exceeded its operational value by a factor of 11. It was the kind of station that existed because decommissioning required paperwork, and paperwork required someone to care. Nobody cared about Cathara 7. Which was why, when the Veth Collective launched its communications blackout campaign across the outer corridor, a campaign designed to isolate fringe settlements before absorption, to cut them off from coalition support before anyone noticed, Cathara 7 became, without warning and without intention, the only functioning relay node within 47 light minutes. Suddenly, the most useless station in the corridor was the only thing standing between 11 inhabited settlements and total informational silence. The coalition received the distress signal. They convened. They calculated. The Beth Collective had 6 warships positioned between the coalition's nearest response fleet and Cathara 7. A rescue operation would require 3 coalition vessels minimum, a transit time of 9 days, and a military engagement with a collective force that the diplomatic corps was still technically negotiating with. The math said no. The vote was 17-2. Abandon the relay. Let the settlements fall dark. Resume contact after the collective's campaign concluded and negotiate from there. The 2 dissenting votes came from the Mendari delegation and, quietly, with no formal record attached, from the single human representative on the Coalition Advisory Board, a woman named Counselor Yara Voss, who reportedly said nothing during the vote, simply recorded her dissent, and left the chamber before the session was formally closed. Sorath Vel had found that detail in the minutes and flagged it 3 times, not because the dissent mattered to the outcome, it hadn't, but because of what came afterward. Because of what Counselor Voss apparently did in the 4 hours following that vote, in the private communications that the Coalition's archival system had technically deleted but not thoroughly enough, fragments of which Sorath Vel's investigation team had spent 2 days reconstructing. The fragments were partial, incomplete, but they were enough to understand that something had been set in motion, something that the Coalition had not authorized. Something that arrived at Cathara 7 on day 3 of the blackout in the form of a single civilian transport vessel, no weapons registry, no military transponder, no formal flight plan that had somehow navigated through the Veth Collective's patrol corridor without being detected, docked with a station that was supposed to be falling silent, and changed everything that happened next. The transport's name, according to the hull registration that Sorath Vel's team eventually traced, was the Persistence of Small Things. She had stared at that name for a long time. The vessel was registered to a shipping collective out of a human fringe settlement called Morrow Station, which itself was barely large enough to appear on standard Coalition navigation charts. 3 crew members on record, a pilot, an engineer, and a medical officer. All human. No military training in any of their files. No affiliation with any known paramilitary or intelligence organization. A pilot, an engineer, and a medic. Against 6 Veth warships, a communications blackout, and a station that the galaxy had officially decided to leave to die. What were they thinking? Said Analyst Drevin, her secondary investigator, when they reviewed the personnel files together. He was Sethborn, methodical, someone who believed that rational actors produced rational actors if you gave them enough information to work with. The personnel files were clearly disturbing his model. These individuals had no tactical value, no weapons. The transport carried commercial cargo, water processing components, and medical cold storage units. What was the strategic logic? Sorath Vel looked at the files again. At the photo of the pilot, a human male named Davin Ore, 43 years old, weathered face, a small scar beneath his left eye that hadn't been cosmetically corrected. She looked at the engineer, Seal Park, 31, who had 3 technical certifications and a gap in her employment record that covered 9 months she couldn't account for in the documentation. She looked at the medic, an older human named Ren Collier, 67, whose file listed 1 prior disciplinary action, a formal reprimand for continuing to treat patients at a quarantine settlement after Coalition Health Authority ordered all personnel to withdraw. I don't think, Sorath Vel said slowly, that there was strategic logic. Drevin made the sound that Sethborn used when they were uncomfortable. Then what was there? She didn't answer. She wasn't sure she had the right word for it yet. The Veth Collective noticed the transport on day 4. This was something Sorath Vel had been able to reconstruct almost completely because the collective kept meticulous records. They were a civilization built on documentation, on evidence, on the belief that cataloging reality was the first step toward controlling it. When the investigation granted her access to the collective's operational logs from the Kethera 7 patrol period, she had expected them to be useful. She had not expected them to be alarming. Patrol Commander Ashendraw's log for that period read in its first entry concerning the human vessel, single civilian transport, non-military configuration, has docked with the target relay station. Purpose unclear. No tactical threat. Monitoring. 3 days later, the same commander wrote, the human vessel has not departed. Station communications remain active. Source unknown. How the station is maintaining relay function under our blackout is not yet determined. Continuing to monitor. 2 days after that, the station should have lost primary power 14 hours ago. It has not. We are detecting thermal variance consistent with manual rerouting of power systems. Complex, inefficient, the kind of modification that should require a full engineering team. The 3 humans appear to be responsible. The set station crew, we note, numbers 41 individuals with full technical training. We believe the humans may be assisting them. We are not certain why this would make any significant difference. Monitoring. Sorath Vel read that entry twice. Then she read the entry from 4 days after that, which was shorter. Station is still active. We do not understand how. And then the entry from day 11, we have decided to board the station and resolve this directly. She found the station's internal logs next. These were the Seth crew's records, the 41 trained technical personnel who had been staffing Cathara 7 when the blackout began, who had been 3 days from total power failure and communications death when the persistence of small things docked without warning in the middle of a maintenance cycle. The crew chief's name was Bel Oron, no relation to Sorath Bell, though the Arbiter had found herself reading his logs with something uncomfortably close to personal feeling. Vel Oron was 58, pragmatic, the kind of station commander who wrote his logs in the stripped-down technical shorthand of someone who'd never expected anyone to read them with real attention. His first entry about the humans read, "Unauthorized civilian docking, Bay 4. Transport crew is 3, all human. Pilot states they are here to help." I informed him that there is nothing a commercial transport crew can do that 41 trained Ceph engineers cannot, and that they should leave before the collective patrol notices them and adds a civilian incident to our problems. The pilot nodded. They did not leave. The second entry, the human engineer, Park, spent 6 hours in the secondary power coupling manifold. I sent 2 of my people to supervise and also, I admit, to escort her out if she started doing something dangerous. They came back 4 hours later and reported that she had not done anything dangerous. She had, without any of our plans or schematics, traced the power fault that we had been trying to locate for 2 days and corrected it. I asked them if they were sure. They were sure. I don't know what to do with this. Sorath Vel looked at that paragraph for a long time. Then she moved to the next one. Day 6. The communications blackout. Park has now done something to the relay array that our own engineers tell me should not work. She calls it a ghetto bounce, a human expression, apparently, meaning a method that is technically wrong but functionally effective. She has bounced our outgoing signal off 3 separate Veth patrol ships, using them as unwitting relay points, so that our transmissions appear to originate from within the collective's own network. We are broadcasting inside the Veth patrol formation. The Veth do not know. I asked Park where she learned this. She said she grew up on Marrow Station and learned to stay in contact with her family across a lot of bad signal terrain. I did not know how to respond to that. She used their own patrol ships, Drevin said when Sorath Vel read that entry aloud. His voice had taken on a new quality, not quite the comfortable analytical tone he'd started the day with. As relay nodes, the collective was unknowingly transmitting the station's distress signals. Through their own network, Sorath Vel confirmed, to 31 fringe settlements simultaneously, including 4 that were already in contact with other human communities. The silence that followed lasted nearly 8 seconds, which for a Seth analyst was equivalent to a much longer silence in any other species. When did the Coalition receive those signals? He asked. They didn't, Sorath Vel said. The signals weren't going to the Coalition. This was the moment in the investigation where Sorath Vel's understanding of the situation had changed, not gradually, not in stages, but in the sudden disorienting way of someone who realizes a shape they've been looking at for days is not the shape they thought it was. The signals weren't going to the Coalition because the Coalition had already voted. The Coalition had done the math. The Coalition had 17-2 decided that Cathara 7 was not worth saving, and Counselor Yara Voss had walked out of that chamber and made 4 hours of communications that the archive system had improperly deleted, and 3 days later a civilian transport with no weapons and no military training had navigated a Veth patrol corridor and docked with a dying station. The signals were going to human settlements. All of them, every human community within the relay's newly extended range. 14 stations, 9 settlements, 2 deep space habitats, a mining collective, and something called the Merrill Compact, which Sorath Vel had to cross-reference twice because it didn't appear in any Coalition registry she had access to, and which turned out, after 3 hours of digging through lateral databases, to be an informal mutual aid network connecting 47 human fringe communities who had developed the habit of responding to each other's emergencies without waiting to be asked. Yara Voss hadn't sent the Coalition to save Cathara 7. She had sent a message. And the message had gone everywhere it needed to go. Sarath Bell sat back from her desk. How many human vessels responded to the signal? Drevin checked his notes. He seemed to be rechecking them, because the first check had apparently produced an answer he needed to verify. 19, he said finally. 19 civilian vessels, arriving in sequence between day 8 and day 13. All unregistered for military activity, all carrying, he paused, mixed cargo, water processing components, medical cold storage. One vessel carrying, apparently, 12 tons of raw polymer sheeting and a welding array. One carrying seeds. Seeds, Sorath Vel repeated. Agricultural seeds. For settlement-scale food production. I don't understand the tactical significance. Neither did I at first, she said. She understood it now. She was still not sure she was emotionally prepared for what it implied. The Veth Collective boarded the station on day 13. Sorath Vel had the boarding logs, the collective's internal incident reports, and most illuminatingly, the debrief transcripts from the Seth crew members who had been present. She had read all of them. She had then read them again. And she still found herself returning to a specific exchange recorded in the Seth crew chief's personal log, written in the chaotic shorthand of someone who did not have time to write properly, but needed to record what was happening before he forgot the details. Veth boarding team, 12 soldiers, Bay 1. The humans, Davin, Silel, Ren, they went to meet them first. I tried to stop Devan. I told him the collective soldiers would detain them, possibly permanently, and that it would be better for my crew to handle the initial contact. He looked at me in the way that I have started to recognize as the look he makes when he is about to do something I don't have a framework for. He said, "They'll hit harder at you than at us. You're the station crew. We're just civilians who got lost." I said that this was insane. He said probably and walked through the door. The next entry, the Veth held them for 6 hours. I monitored via the corridor sensors. The humans did not appear to be in distress. Ren, the medic, at one point appeared to tell a story that made 2 of the Veth soldiers physically uncomfortable, though I could not hear it through the sensor audio. Devan was asked, repeatedly by my count, whether there were other vessels en route to the station. He said he didn't know. He said this each time with exactly the same intonation. I'm not sure he was lying. I'm not sure it matters. Then, the Veth released them after 6 hours. I asked Taban what happened. He said they talked. I asked what about. He said they talked about. He said they talked about families. He said one of the Veth soldiers had young ones at home. I asked what that had to do with anything. He said usually nothing. He said sometimes everything. I have been the crew chief of the station for 11 years, and I have no data structure that accommodates this man. The Veth released them, Drevin said. When Sarath Vel walked him through this section, he'd stopped taking notes. His hands were flat on the desk. After 6 hours, and then went back to their patrol formation, Sarath Vel said, without destroying the station, without disabling the relay, without apparently reaching a clear strategic decision about what to do. Why? She found the entry in the collective's own logs, Commander Ashendra, writing on the same day. Interrogation of the 3 human civilians was inconclusive. They present as non-threats. They appear to believe they are simply here to help. I cannot verify this. I cannot verify the opposite. The humans are, I am using this word carefully, confusing. They do not match any behavioral model I have for an adversary. They are not afraid in the ways I can exploit. They are afraid in ways I don't know what to do with. We are resuming standard patrol. We will reevaluate the station boarding question in 72 hours. She closed the file. She looked at Drevin. Devan Ore sat in a room with Veth soldiers for 6 hours and somehow convinced them to delay. By talking about families. By being something the Veth hadn't prepared a response for, she said. Which is what I keep finding, over and over. The humans weren't stronger than the Veth. They weren't better armed. They weren't operating under any plan that I can fully reconstruct. They were just, she stopped. What? Present, she said, continuously, stubbornly, irrationally present. When every calculation said leave, when every model said it wasn't worth it, they just kept being there. The other 17 vessels arrived between day 8 and day 13. Not military, not armed, each one carrying exactly what its manifest said it was carrying, which means the Veth Patrol scans found water components, medical supplies, polymer sheeting, agricultural seed stock, 3 cargo containers of insulation foam, a secondary atmospheric processor that one vessel had apparently removed from its own life support backup to bring, 2 human medical teams, and 1 man who arrived alone on a 1-person survey craft with no cargo at all, whose passenger manifest listed his occupation simply as mechanist. His name was Torev Dan. He was 54 years old. He had, as best Sarath Vel could determine, spent his entire career working on atmospheric machinery at a remote mining habitat. He had no special training, no military record, no apparent heroic background of any kind. He had, apparently, heard the signal and come. Vel Oron's log noted his arrival with something that read almost like wonder, another one. This one says he heard we had a problem with the tertiary atmospheric cycling array, which we do, and which I don't know how we would know, since I filed that maintenance request internally. He says the signal included technical system data. I checked. The signal included technical system data. CL Park encoded our complete maintenance backlog into the distress transmission. I'm going to need a moment. Sorath Vel had needed a moment at that point, too. Park had encoded the station's full technical repair list into the distress signal. Not just help us, not just we are dying, but here's what we need, here is what is broken, here is what each repair requires. Come with specific skills or specific materials because we don't have time for you to arrive and figure it out. 19 vessels responded. Each one brought something specific. The machinist arrived and went directly to the atmospheric array. He was working within 40 minutes of docking. Valeron's log. I asked him how long the repair would take. He said 2 days if he was lucky and 4 days if he wasn't. And he had learned not to plan past that. I asked if he wanted to review our technical schematics first. He said he already had. He'd downloaded them during approach. I didn't know we had publicly accessible technical schematics. Apparently, CL Park uploaded them to a shared human network database 2 days ago. I'm going to need another moment. The Veth Collective returned in force on day 16, not 12 soldiers this time. The full complement of 2 warships, docking authorization demanded, compliance expected. This was in the collective's logs, stark and confident. Station Cathara 7 has resisted our blackout operations beyond any projected threshold. Coalition rescue was calculated as impossible. The station should have fallen silent by day 6. It is day 16. We will resolve this today. What the collective found when they breached the docking bay was a fully operational relay station, 41 Seth crew members at their stations, 11 alien species represented in the civilian support crews, and 22 humans, the 3 original crew of the Persistence of Small Things, and 19 additional arrivals, who had in 13 days repaired every major system on a station the Coalition had classified as functionally terminal, extended its communications range by a factor of 3 using techniques that the Collective's own technical team would later describe as inadvisable but effective, and established a continuous broadcast to 31 settlements across the outer corridor that the Veth had been trying to silence. The collective boarding commander asked, according to the transcript Sorath Vel had read so many times she nearly had it memorized, who was in charge. There was a pause in the record. A 4-second pause, which meant something actually happened in that 4 seconds that the transcript didn't capture. Then Devon Ore said, "Nobody's really in charge, we're just fixing things." The collective commander said, "This station was assessed as non-viable. How are you still operational?" And Ore said, and this was the part Sorath Vel kept returning to, kept reading with the feeling that she was understanding something she hadn't had the right concept for before. He said, the assessment was probably accurate. We just didn't know that when we started, and by the time we did, we were already here. There were 6 more days. The Veth Collective, faced with a station that should have been dead and wasn't, facing 22 humans who didn't behave like an opposing force because they weren't one, who were just there, working, repairing, broadcasting, made a series of decisions that their own post-incident review would later classify as a cascade of strategic miscalculation, each one flowing from the same foundational error. The foundational error was this: the collective had been designed in its military doctrine to respond to resistance. The humans weren't resisting, they were repairing a water processor. You understand what this means, so Rathvel said to Drevin on the 3rd day of reconstructing this period. They had been in the investigation room for 9 hours. The light had shifted from pale to amber to the dark blue of the station's evening cycle. The collective's entire response protocol assumed an adversary behaving as an adversary. They prepared for a fight and found, what? A machinist, a medic, a pilot who wanted to talk about families. They didn't know how to escalate against people who weren't escalating, Drevin said. They ran their boarding actions and found civilians doing civilian things. They issued warnings and the humans acknowledged the warnings and kept working. They set a departure deadline and Dobbin or Ray said, she checked the transcript. He said, that's fair, we'll try to wrap up what we can before then. And then he went back to the atmospheric array. Drevin was quiet for a moment. Did they meet the deadline? No, Sarathvel said. They missed it by 31 hours. They were in the middle of replacing a power junction, and the collective extended the deadline, she said, twice. The silence that followed felt like the whole investigation room was catching its breath. Why? Drevin said. Sorath Bell found Commander Ashendre's log again. The final relevant entry, written on day 21. I have reviewed our engagement options against Cathara 7 for the 4th time in 7 days. Each review produces the same result. We can destroy the station. This is within our tactical authority. We cannot destroy the station without destroying 22 human civilians who are not combatants, not affiliates of any military structure, and who have on 3 separate occasions provided assistance to our own personnel. The medic treated one of my soldiers for a respiratory condition without being asked, without requiring authorization, and without accepting any form of payment or exchange. I filed a report requesting clarification on the rules of engagement for human non-combatants. I am still waiting for that clarification. The humans, meanwhile, have now extended the station's broadcast range to cover 4 settlements that were previously unreachable within our blackout zone. I believe they are doing this deliberately. I cannot prove they are doing this deliberately. I cannot prove they are not doing this deliberately. We are maintaining position. He never received clarification. Because on day 22, the coalition's position changed. Not from military intervention, not from a second vote. From 31 settlements broadcasting their status into a network that had, through Seal Park's ghetto bounce relay and 17 civilian vessels, become impossible to suppress. From voices pouring through a station that should have been dead, speaking into a galaxy that had decided not to listen until the volume became something that the diplomatic corps could no longer classify as background noise. The coalition reconvened. The vote this time was 14-5 in favor of dispatching a formal response fleet. Sarath Vel had attended that session as part of her investigatory role. She had watched the chamber. She had noted with the particular attention she gave to small significant details that Counselor Yara Voss sat through the entire session without speaking, without contributing a single word of argument or persuasion. She had simply been present, recording her vote, watching. The needle was still bothering her on the investigation's final day. Everything else she had answered. The strategic logic, to the extent there had been any. The technical mechanisms, the sequence of events. The collective's withdrawal, which happened 4 days after the coalition fleet arrived, in an engagement that lasted less than 2 hours because the collective had spent 3 weeks failing to resolve what should have been a 6-day operation and had lost the strategic patience and political standing to press further. The settlement saved 11, plus the 31 that had maintained contact through the relay's extended broadcast. She had documented it all. She had written a report that was already, she suspected, going to be read by more people than most Arbiter reports reached in a decade. But the needle, she went back to the wall panel where it had been found. The polymer showed the extraction mark, a small circle of removed material where the prying tool had worked around it. She stood at the height a human would stand, arm extended to approximately where a human's arm would reach, and she looked at the angle. Behind her, a voice said, "You're holding your arm wrong." She turned. Devanoro was in the corridor doorway. He had stayed on the station through the investigation with a calm patience that she had stopped trying to interpret as tactical and had started simply accepting as a characteristic. He was shorter than most species she worked with. The scar beneath his eye caught the corridor light. "You're trying to figure out what it was for," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. He came and stood next to her. He reached up, not where she'd been reaching, slightly lower and further left, and at a different angle, and pressed his fingertips against the wall. Salil had a pneumatic clamp here, holding a power cable in position, while she rerouted the junction. She needed both hands for the actual work. She improvised. Sorath Vel looked at the wall. "A needle." "She carries a sewing kit," he said. "Old habit. Her grandmother taught her. You'd be surprised how often the needle is the right tool." Sorath Vel turned that over. She used a sewing needle to hold a power cable in position during an emergency rerouting of a station's primary junction. It worked. "It is," she said carefully, "the most inadvisable engineering solution I have encountered in 14 years of arbitration work." "Yeah, probably," Oray agreed. He seemed to find this unremarkable. She looked at him for a moment. "I need to ask you something directly." "Sure." "At any point during this," she gestured, finding the word insufficient, gesturing more broadly to encompass the whole station, the investigation, the 22 days, the needle, all of it. "Did you believe you were going to survive?" The 4-second pause. The same pause from the transcript. Then Devon Oray said, "I stopped asking that question around day 4. "Why day 4? "Because we were already committed by then. The junction was half array routed. The signal was half bounced. Ren was already treating patients. If we'd stopped then, we'd have left it worse than if we hadn't come at all. So." He shrugged. A very human gesture that Sorath Vel had learned conveyed more than it looked like. "We didn't stop." She was quiet for a long moment. "The coalition," she said, "calculated that this station had a survival probability of less than 3%. "Seems about right," he said. "The water reclamation alone was." "You knew that." He looked at her. "We read the infrastructure reviews before we came." The corridor was very still. She said, "You read the coalition's assessment. You knew the station was classified as non-viable. You came anyway." "The assessment was right," he said. "As of when they wrote it, but that was 3 days before we got here. Situations change." Sorath Bell felt something settle into place in her understanding. Not comfortably, not cleanly, but with the weight of something that was going to stay. "Situations change," she repeated. "People change situations," he said, with the simple directness of someone who had never thought this was remarkable. "That's the part I think you keep leaving out of the calculation." Her report was filed. The investigation was officially closed. The Veth Collective would withdraw from 3 additional contested corridors in the following months, a diplomatic consequence of the Cathara 7 incident, of the political cost of 3 weeks spent failing to suppress a relay station staffed by a pilot, an engineer, and a medic from a settlement too small to appear on standard navigation charts. 11 settlements maintained contact. Voices that should have gone dark kept speaking. The Marrow Compact added 6 new communities in the year that followed, all of them connected through channels that CL Park had opened with a ghetto bounce and a sewing needle. Councillor Yara Voss returned to the coalition chamber. She continued to vote. She continued, when she disagreed, to record the dissent without argument, without performance, without the speeches that history tends to require from people it's about to write down. She just kept showing up. She kept casting the vote. She kept watching. And Commander Ashendraw of the Veth Collective filed one final personal addendum to his Cathara 7 report, months after the fact, after the withdrawal, after the diplomatic resolution, after the whole thing had been packaged into the historical record and assigned its official meaning. Sorath Vel found it in a lateral database that her team hadn't originally flagged, and she read it on a quiet morning when the investigation was closed, and she had no particular reason to keep looking. It said in its entirety, "I have spent considerable time trying to identify what tactical error we made at Cathara 7. I have reviewed our patrols, our boarding decisions, our engagement protocols, our deadline extensions. Each individual decision was defensible given available information. The compound result was failure. I believe now that the error was categorical rather than tactical. We were prepared for enemies. We were prepared for neutrals. We were prepared for surrender. We were not prepared for a species that would look at a station the galaxy had decided was lost and say, not with heroism, not with drama, not with any apparent awareness that they were doing something extraordinary, simply, not yet. Not while we're still here. I don't know how to write a protocol for that. I don't know that it can be defended against. I'm not sure I want to know." Sorath Vel kept a copy of that addendum. She kept it not for the investigation, not for the report, not for any official purpose. She kept it for the same reason she kept returning to the image of the needle, not as evidence of something larger, but as the thing itself. The specific, small, inadvisable thing that held the power cable in place while both hands did the real work. The galaxy had calculations for everything. Survival probabilities and strategic values and infrastructure reviews and voting chambers and 17-2 majorities. The galaxy had over centuries built very good systems for determining what was worth saving. The humans hadn't argued with those systems. They had read the assessments. They had understood the math. They had traveled through a Veth patrol corridor in a vessel called the Persistence of Small Things, and they had docked, and they had begun fixing the water reclamation unit. And when the Veth arrived, they had talked about families, and when the deadline came, they had missed it because they were in the middle of a power junction. And somewhere in all of that, in the gap between what the math said was possible and what actually happened, an entire corridor of settlements had kept their voices. Not because the humans were the strongest species in the galaxy, not because they had better ships or better weapons or better calculations. Because when the calculation said 3%, they hadn't asked whether to try. They had asked what was still broken, and they had started there. And the galaxy, which had learned to measure everything worth saving, was only beginning to understand that it had never once thought to measure what happened to a species that never learned to stop.